Dear learners, welcome you all to e-learning platform. Me, Faisal Ahmed, faculty member, Department of English, World University of Bangladesh. Let's begin the lesson of week 1 and welcome you all to the very beginning of the semester fall 2021. So in this semester you are doing Introduction to 20th Century Literature with me. So in this very first week you will learn something about what is 20th century literature, and specifically we will focus on poetry, 20th century poetry. Okay, and we will also get to know the famous names of 20th century poets, and also we will learn the characteristics of their poetry. So this course is designed to focus on literary movements like modernism and postmodernism in the 20th century English poetry, with special attention to the key poetic figures like William Butler Yeats, Thomas Sterne Eliot and Dylan Thomas. And you will have some ideas about modernism, postmodernism, realism and nationalism, two different dimensions of cross-cultural reading, differences between individual responses, along with political and socio-economic circumstances. You will also be able to focus on characteristics of modern and postmodern poetry, on the multiplicity of layered meanings by a close textual analysis of poetic works in relation with modernism and postmodernism, and also on the relationship between literary texts, stylistic features and poets, socio-political outlooks on cultural issues in the British poetic tradition, British and Irish poetic tradition. So let's know some famous names of modern poets. The most striking thing in 20th century English literature is the revolution in poetic taste and practice. Various movements and changes had a greater influence upon modern poetry. Though poets are often influenced by each other and sometimes share a common outlook, their style and the ways of writing differ from each other. So modern poetry is essentially a private art form, and it contains very much a story of individual poets. So in this period you will get the famous poets like T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats and Dylan Thomas, who were selected for this semester. And other modern poets are Thomas Hardy, Gerard Manley Hopkins, W.H. Auden, Ted Hughes, Robert Graves, R.S. Thomas, Philip Larkin, Stevie Smith, Seamus Heaney, and some white poets like Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg. So these are the famous names. Okay, so let's know something about them in brief. T.S. Eliot is one of the most remarkable of English poets. He had great influence on poetry for more than 40 years. He sees poetry and ceremony as forces that can give meaning to the emptiness and confusion of the modern world. He gives great importance to the forces that make it possible for spiritual as well as physical life to continue. The Wasteland is Eliot's major work or masterpiece. It is very long and complex poem which explains the barrenness of the modern people. The poem contains many old myths, literary allusions, languages, music, as well as different kinds of characters. There is spiritual dryness in the wasteland where renewal of life is impossible. The poem shows the emptiness and meaninglessness of modern life and modern world. Eliot sees the root cause of modern world's unhappiness and confusion is the people's inability to bring together the different areas of their experiences to make a complete and healthy whole. W.V. Yeats. W.V. Yeats was without doubt one of the greatest English poets, and he is also a Nobel laureate, and T.S. Eliot also a Nobel laureate, who got the Nobel Prize in Literature. These two poets. By birth and temperament, W.V. Yeats was a poet of the Irish traditions. He was born in Ireland. Irish history, people, language, traditions, and nationalism are always in the mind of the poet when he is writing, though the theme of his later poetry is universal. The use of symbol and imagery, symbolism, and the combination of magic and mystery also become characteristic of Yeats, who is the great poet. At times we find the use of classical and Celtic mythology in his poetry. His later poetry uses plainer language in his description of human nature. Dylan Thomas. He is a famous poet who was born and brought up in Wales. Wales is a land in the United Kingdom, which is combined of Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and England. The capital city of Wales is Cardiff. So Dylan Thomas is a Welsh poet. His language is not plain and simple, as Welsh language is different from English one, which is another dialectic or dialogue in England, in the United Kingdom. It is full of life, energy, feeling, and strength. So Thomas' religious poetry sometimes attains the strength of the spoken Welsh words. His work praises and delights in natural forces. His purpose of writing was to touch and show people their own human feelings. Thomas Hardy, another famous modern poet. Hardy is regarded as a great English novelist and poet as well of this century, the modern century. He wrote poetry throughout his long life and considered it more important than his novels. As a poet, he sets out to show the other side of common emotions. His poetry does not suggest that life is a bitter tragedy. Hardy believes that life is hard and uncertain, but the man possesses the strength to tolerate its hardship and continues to struggle in life. His poetry shows great delight in the natural beauty of the world and at the touch of humor in events. Hardy describes human hardship and suffering by looking at them from a distance. Though his language is legendarily direct, is generally direct, at times it is loaded with unusual words and sentences. Gerard Hopkins was a poet of religious faith. He appears as a devout, humble Christian. He was a religious poet. So if you go through the poetry of Gerald Manley Hopkins, you will get the elements of religion. The theme of his poetry is the relationship of man to God and the problem of suffering in a world created by God. W.H. Auden. Auden is one of the most famous poets of the modern age. He was born in England and later in his life he went to stay in America. He mainly wrote his early poems in political and social themes. So he is a political and social poet. There the poems are examinations of the contemporary English situation. Some of his poems directly deal with political events and their effect on people's lives. The poems which he wrote in America are concerned very closely with the individual in contemporary organized society. He expresses a strong sense of the realities of everyday life. Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes' poetry is concerned with the strong and violent forces of nature. He is influenced by D.H. Lawrence by making the animals and birds the subjects of many of his poems. The poet intends to express the human condition, therefore his animals are powerful as symbols. Hodges attempts to capture the mystery of life and experience of animal characterization. So he made a parallelism between man and animal and shows some underlying meaning through them. Robert Gray, he is one of the important poets of this century. Many of his poems are love poems. In such poems he deals with as a central subject the relationship between man and women. He shows how physical love between man and women can bring back life to the world and the lost sense of innocence and wonder to human relationship. So he deals with human relationship, especially man and women, the romantic one. R.S. Thomas is Welsh and he is a clergyman by profession. Thomas follows the tradition of British poets who have written about the country. His poems deal with the hardship of country life. Philip Larkin. Larkin is one of the most important poets since the war, the First World War. He is the center figure of the group who began movement poetry. This group of poets rejected the tradition of Dylan Thomas that poetry should express high emotion and feeling and forces of nature. Their subject tend to be smaller and their language more clearly controlled. In much of the poetry there is a sense that reality is dull and unattractive. But that living through a dream is equally impossible. Larkin is very much influenced by Hardy, who is concerned with the real life, the struggle of real life, and the enjoyment, sorrows and sufferings and joys of real life. So who are different from other imaginative poets like Dylan Thomas, poet of nature. Stevie Smith. Smith is a naive writer whose voice is always clear and unmistakable and whose expression is spontaneous. She writes poems in her simple language and she treats common reality and experience of people in them. Many of her poems concerned with good and evil carry on a direct debate over the mystery of religion. She writes about her dislike of cruel people and gives sharp and critical description of how people behave to each other. Her aim of writing was ethical and didactic as well as to be entertained. Seamus Heaney, another major poet of the 20th century. Heaney is an Irish poet who is influenced by R.S. Thomas and Ted Hughes. Like them, he writes of the countryside and of the natural world in his early poems. His later poems move from private history to the public events of the past and how they have influenced the present political and military situation in Northern Ireland. Heaney is attempting to go beyond the daily events of the life around him and to discover the forces below his country's history that can bring back life and hope. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. So now let's know some wire poets like Rupert Brooke. Rupert Brooke is one of the most famous poets of the wire, but he does not express the painful view of the suffering caused by the wire in his poetry. The romantic and patriotic view of many soldiers at the beginning of the war is reflected in one of his most famous poems. For Brooke, death for a soldier was a great sacrifice for his country. So this poet is like patriotic. Siegfried Sassoon. Other war poets have truly expressed the painful realities of war. As an English soldier, Sassoon fought in France and gathered the real experience of the destructive war. So, Siegfried Sassoon was a soldier and a poet as well. So, he expressed his real experience of war in his poetry. In his poems, his anger is directed at the pointlessness of war. He severely attacks those military senior officers who plunge the innocent soldier into the war. So Siegfried is just opposite to Rupert Brooke. Rupert Brooke inspired the soldier for patriotism, whereas Siegfried Sassoon brought out the bad side or the cruel side of war and the inhuman side of war, who discourage war and also the soldiers to go to the war and do some destructive tasks. He hates those people at home who ignore the misery and sufferings of the soldiers. The poets accuse them of believing the false heroic stories of war told by governments. Wilfred Owen, another war poet, he is the best known English poet of the First World War. Like Sassoon, he describes the realities of war pain, horror, and the suffering of the soldier in his poem. He mentions how the war destroyed the soldiers' happiness and damaged their mind permanently. Owen did not accept the romantic and patriotic view of the war as Brooke did. So Wilfred Owen agrees with Siegfried Sassoon, and they both disagree with Rupert Brooke. Isaac Rosenberg. He belonged to a working class family and served as an ordinary soldier in the war. He had not received much formal education, so his experience of life in the war is different from other poets. This is reflected in the language of his poetry and in the events he describes. He did not follow the models and traditions of earlier poetry. He has used a new form of poetry to describe his new experience. His language has great life and energy. So, when the First World War came in 1914, the poets' minds were filled with heroic and nationalistic feelings. Their poems gave a romantic and patriotic view, while some others discouraged the war and the soldiers through observing the horror and sufferings of war. Rupert Brooke wrote representative poems giving a traditional view of war. His 5 wild sonnets represent the romantic and enthusiastic feelings of the people, but in the later poets we see the sad realities of war. The poets of the Second World War are very different, as many people have suffered the darker side of life during the after-war period. They did not have the same hope and enthusiasm. These poets often showed a sense of tiredness and a sense of helplessness. The language was also plain and simple. Some of the poets of the Second World War are Sidney K.S., Alan Lewis, Roy Fuller, and Keith Douglas. So these are the 20th century modern poets who wrote on different topics like nature, barrenness of modern people, and also write about the reality of life, the struggle of life, and also some poet wrote about the horror suffering in war, and also some other encourage the soldiers to go to the war, and also praise the bravery and their patriotism in war. So, and some other poets wrote about politics and society as well. Okay, so the real life is reflected in their poems in different modern poetry. So now we are going to learn about the characteristics of modern poetry. Characteristics of modern poetry. Modern poetry is written in simple language, the language of everyday speech, and even sometimes in dialect or jargon, like some poems of Rudyard Kipling in the jargon of soldiers. Modern poetry is mostly sophisticated as a result of the sophistication of the modern age. For example, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Alienation. The poet is alienated from the reader as a result of alienation of the modern man, which is like absent-minded imagination or something like that. Fragmentation. The modern poem is sometimes fragmented or divided like a series of broken images, and again like the wasteland. Jeopardized. So many different things which are blocked together, and sometimes that leads to misunderstand or very difficult to understand. Modern poetry is highly intellectual. It is written from the mind of the poet and it addresses the mind of the reader, like the poems of T.S. Eliot. It is interested in the ugly side of life and in taboo subjects like drug addiction, crime, prostitution, and some other subjects where nature and politics and society, like the poems of Allen Ginsberg. Modern poetry is pessimistic as a result of the bad condition of man in many parts of the world, such as most of the poems of Thomas Hardy. Modern poetry is suggestive. The poem may suggest different meanings to different readers. Modern poetry is cosmopolitan. It appeals to man everywhere and at every time because it deals with the problems of man or humanity. Experimentation is one of the important characteristic feature of modern poetry. Poets try to break new grounds and reveal new ones, to find new forms, new language, and new methods of expression. It is irregular, written without meter and rhyme scheme, and sometimes written in prose like the prose poem. Interest in politics and the political problems of the age. It also depicts interest in the psychology and in the subconscious mind. Many poets wrote unconsciously under the effect of wine, drugs, or after suffering the horror of war. Irregularity of form. Modern poetry is mostly written in free verse and prose. The prose poem. Ambiguity. Most of the modern poetry is ambiguous for many readers. Very difficult to understand. Interest in myth, and especially Greek myth. Interest in problems of the average man and the lower classes of society rather than upper class one or royalty. So that's all the characteristics of modern poems, and I think you can proceed, you can better understand the modern poets and their poems. So that's all for this week, and that's the end of week 1. Thank you very much for being with me, and we will learn more in the next lesson. Until then, goodbye.